Hi, my name is Marianne Resty Hubahib, a third year BSc student.
So hi everyone, I am Jhon Rio R Paradero, a third year student taking up Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering.
So, hi everyone, I am Cristel Ann Canonigo and I am now in my third year taking up Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering.
Hello everyone, I am Jhon Rio Suarez, a BSc third year student.
And for this video, our main topic is the Greek philosopher Epicurus.
Hi everyone, I am Jhon Rio R Paradero and today we are going to learn about this guy, Epicurus. Yes, Epicurus. His life as a philosopher, his work and theories, his contribution to the society and how we view things such as justice, pleasure, desire, virtues, and many more other things. So, I hope you will bear with us all throughout this presentation. So, to start this presentation, I asked some of my random friends and neighbors if they know this guy right here, Epicurus. So please hear their answers. First is, I asked my friend Juva.
I'm sorry, but I don't know him.
I got a no, so I moved forward and asked my another friend, Nathaniel. And here is his honest answer.
Wala, I don't know him ba ya?
Next is, I asked my major subject teacher, Mr. Ledesma.
No, dili siya familiar.
He also is not familiar about Epicurus. So lastly, I asked my friend Mary Jean and this is her answer.
I think he is a philosopher, but I don't know anything about him.
She guessed it right, but still, she does not know him. So who really is this guy? Epicurus. So to better understand him, let's go reporting. Hi. So before we will start about the ethics of Epicurus, we need first to know his life and how did he live his life in order for us to relate it to his ethics. So when we talk about life of a person, first question we come up in mind is when did he was born and where did he grow up? So the first question, when did he was born? Epicurus was born around 341 BCE or before Common Era, 7 years after Plato's death. Next is, where did he grow up? So Epicurus grew up in an Athenian colony of Samos. Samos is an island located in the Mediterranean Sea. So he was about 19 when Aristotle died, and he studied philosophy under followers of Democritus and Plato. Epicurus founded his first philosophical schools in Mytilene and Lampsakos. Afterwards, he moved to Athens around 306 BCE or before Common Era. There, Epicurus founded the garden. So what is a garden? So a garden is a combination of philosophical community and a school. So the residents of the garden put Epicurus' teaching into practice. Epicurus is one of the major philosophers in the Hellenistic period. So what is a Hellenistic period? So to know that, let us first have a trivia or a trivia time. So for our first trivia, let's talk about Hellenistic period. So it is just a short explanation, so please bear with me. So In 336 BC, Alexander the Great became the leader of the Greek kingdom of Macedonia. By the time he died 13 years later, Alexander the Great had built an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to India. So that brief but thorough empire building campaign changed the world. So it spread Greek ideas and culture from eastern side of the Mediterranean up to the Asia. So historians call this era as the Hellenistic period. So the word Hellenistic comes from the word Helazin, which means to speak or identify with the Greeks. So it lasted from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC until 31 BC, when Roman troops conquered the last of the territories that the Macedonian king Alexander the Great had once ruled. So remember, 323 BC up to 31 BC. So that is the period which is called the Hellenistic. Thank you. So yeah, it is the 3 centuries following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE and Aristotle in 322 BCE. Now, we often talk about BCE. So, we know that BCE stands for Before Common Era, but what does it really implies? And how does it differentiate with other dating abbreviation like AD, like CE? So, to further understand it, so as a side note, so let us first tackle about this abbreviation on my next trivia. Hi! For our second trivia, it is basically a question. What is the difference between AD and CE and BC and BCE? So to answer that, there is no difference in dating. So just in the terms. So for example, AD means Anno Domini. It's not after death. It is a Greek word Anno Domini, which means in the year of the Lord, referring to the birth of Jesus Christ. So CE, the abbreviation for Common Era, is used to mark time in the same way. Now, why is that it changed from AD to CE? So explanations are, there are some people who are not Christians, so they do not believe on Christ. So to neutralize things, they use CE instead of AD, which means the year of the Lord. So it seems ironic, for it still refers to the year of the Lord, just the name which changed. Next is BC and BCE. So BC stands for Before Christ and BCE stands for Before Common Era. So what are their differences? So basically they are just the same. They are just named different because of the non-believers of Jesus Christ. So to neutralize things up, they use BCE instead of BC, but they are just the same. So to better understand, for example, 100 AD is just the same as 100 CE. So as 200 BC and 200 BCE, they are just referring to the same date. So to sum it up, BC is just equal to BCE and AD is just equal to CE. So I hope you learned something about those dating abbreviations. And to move forward, Epicurus developed an unsparingly materialistic metaphysics, empiricist epistemology, and hedonistic ethics. So materialistic because he is a person who believe that there is no influence of God in our life. So to move forward, Epicurus taught that the basic constituent of the world are atoms. So to better understand it, let's have our third trivia. Epicurus believes that the basic constituent of the world are atoms, which are uncountable microscopic bits of matter, moving in a void, which he defines void as simply an empty space. Ordinary objects are conglomerations of atoms. Furthermore, he believed that the properties of macroscopic bodies and all of the event we see can be explained in terms of the collisions, reboundings, and entanglements of atoms. So when we talk about atoms, probably the first philosopher that will pop up in our minds will be Democritus. So up to this point, Epicurus is largely following the thought of Democritus, a pre-Socratic philosopher and one of the inventors of atomism. However, he have some modifications of what is Democritus' definition of atomism. These are the weight, the swerve, and the sensible qualities. So these three are the major modifications of Epicurus to the one that is presented by Democritus. So now we know that Epicurus tried to explain all natural phenomena in atomic terms. So to move forward, Epicurus also rejected the existence of Platonic forms and an immaterial soul, and he said that the gods have no influence on our lives. So Epicurus also thought skepticism was unattainable, and we could gain knowledge of the world relying only upon our own senses. So he really do not believe on something like God that made all things possible. He is a person who believes that we are on our own. He believes that there is no greater entity that will help us instead of relying on our own senses. He thought also that the point of all actions is to attain pleasure for oneself. So for example, if you are playing, so you are having pleasure for yourself. For example, you are studying, so we believe that it is for your own pleasure. Or anything that you do, you are doing it for the sake of your pleasure, a pleasure for yourself. So that is what he believed to be the truth about pleasure. So he believed that this could be done by limiting one's desire and by banishing the fear of the gods and of death. So to achieve pleasure or to achieve that pleasure for oneself, so we should limit our desire. So by limiting our desire, so we should banish the fear that we have to gods or other entity or death. Epicurus' gospel of freedom and fear proved to be quite popular, and communities of Epicureans flourished for centuries after his death. So how did he die? So Epicurus died from a kidney stone around 270 or 271 BCE. After Epicurus' death, Epicureanism continued to flourish as a philosophical movement. So after he died, many Epicurean communities sprung up all throughout the Hellenistic period. But with the rise of Christianity, Epicureanism went into decline. Let's move forward to the ethics being presented by Epicurus. So for example, he says that the only thing that is intrinsically valuable is one's own pleasure. Anything else that has a value is valuable merely as a means of securing pleasure for oneself. However, Epicurus has a sophisticated and idiosyncratic view of the nature of pleasure, which leads him to recommend a virtuous, moderately ascetic life as the best means of securing pleasure. For example, if you value your job, this just means that you value it because you want pleasure for yourself. If, for example, you value a certain thing, so you value that certain thing because of the pleasure it brought to you by that thing. So basically, anything that have value is only valuable merely for the purpose of having pleasure for yourself. For example, that phone right there is valuable to me because it gives pleasure to myself. And this charger over here is also valuable to me because it brought pleasure to my life. That is what Epicurus means by this example. So to start, let us tackle about Hedonism, psychological and ethical. So Epicurus' ethics starts from the Aristotelian commonplace that the highest good is what is valued for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. So what does this mean? So it means that the highest good is an end in itself. So an end in itself. So therefore, it is something that is pursued in its own right to the exclusion of others. So that is what the highest good, according to Epicurus and Aristotle. However, he disagrees with Aristotle in some aspects, like he identifies happiness with pleasure. By this, he has two reasons, and I'm going to present these two reasons to you. So, his main reason is the idea that pleasure is the only thing that people do, as a matter of fact, value for its own sake. So, he believes that by pleasure, we work by pleasure. So, we do anything, we do something for the sake of pleasure. We don't do something to expect pain or sufferings. We do something because we want pleasure at the end of it. So that is how he reasoned out the idea of pleasure being connected to happiness. So in everything that we do, he said or claims that we do this for the ultimate sake of gaining pleasure for ourselves. So if I relate this in my life today, it is somehow true because, like for example, I am studying. So I am studying in order for me to gain pleasure for myself or to achieve something at the end of it. So I am doing this report because I want to pass the subject, and ultimately it gains pleasure to myself. So it is somehow true. So that is why I said that his claim is somehow true as of today, as of my life. So this is observed by observing infants' behavior. So it is claimed that infants instinctively pursue pleasure and shun pain. So whenever we see a child, it still does not have an idea of the world, but what it pursues is happiness rather than pain. So that is why Epicurus identify happiness with pleasure. So the Epicureans did try their best to convince the world that in everything that we do it because we want pleasure at the end of it. So anything that we do it because we want to obtain pleasure for ourselves. Now, the second proof is that one immediately perceives that pleasure is good and pain is bad. He exclaimed that nobody likes to have pain, therefore he labeled pain as bad so as good for pleasure. So he believed that it is very basic or obvious to show the goodness of pleasure and the badness of pain. Like for example, identifying this one as a cell phone. So it is very obvious that this one is a cell phone. And also identifying this one as a charger. So it is very obvious to identify this thing as charger. So as identifying fire as hot and ice as cold. Yeah, that is how obvious goodness of pleasure and the badness of pain. That is what he means by his second proof. Although all pleasures are good and all pains are evil, Epicurus says that not all pleasure are choice-worthy and all pains to be avoided. Instead, one should calculate what is in one's long-term self-interest and forego what will bring pleasure in a short term if doing so will ultimately lead to greater pleasure in the long term. What does he mean by this? So he wants us to think in the longer run. So he wants us to think ahead and not just enjoy what is in the present. So hi everyone, I think that's all my part of this presentation to discuss to you about the life of Epicurus and his first ethics about Hedonism. So I hope you learned something about my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, it's me, Resty, and I'm going to be your next reporter. So at this point, you already know what hedonism is, right? So the topic that I'm going to discuss is somehow related, or it just connects to the topic that was discussed by Rio a while ago. So the topics that I'm going to tackle are types of pleasures and the types of desire according to Epicurus' philosophical views. So let's get to the types of pleasure. So for Epicurus, pleasure is tied closely to satisfying one's desire. So he distinguishes between two different types of pleasure. We have moving pleasure and static pleasure. So for moving pleasure, these pleasures occur when one is in the process of achieving or satisfying his or her desire. So these pleasures involve an active titillation of the senses, and these feelings are what most people call pleasure. So meaning our senses are used to feel pleasure. So for example, if we are hungry or we are craving for something to eat, or like for example, we are craving for ice cream. So at that moment, your desire is to eat ice cream. So you decided to go to the nearest stall or store that sells ice cream, and so you buy and then eat and eat and eat. So that process we have there is what we call moving pleasures, since we used our as sense of taste to experience that pleasure. And after you eat and eat and eat until your ice cream is finished, or you're already finished eating it and you feel satisfied, then that's what we call static pleasure. So static pleasure can be viewed as being in a state of having satisfied one's desire, just like in our example. And also pleasure of being in a state of not having certain types of desire. And also pleasure one has when functioning in the natural state without interference. So basing on our example a while ago, so after you finished eating your ice cream and you feel satisfied about it, then that means you just fulfilled your desire, or your desire for ice cream that you've craved a while ago, or before you eat ice cream, has just been satisfied or fulfilled, and that's what we call static pleasure. And according to Epicurus, static pleasures are the best pleasures. Because of this, Epicurus denies that there is any intermediate state between pleasure and pain. So meaning there is no in between. So when one has unfulfilled desire, or his or her desire wasn't satisfied, then that is painful. And when one no longer has any desire, then that steady state is the most pleasurable of all. We cannot call it as some intermediate state between pleasure and pain. Remember the second definition of static pleasures that I presented a while ago? That static pleasure is being in a state of not having certain types of desire. Before we proceed to our next lesson, somehow this came into my mind. All of us will definitely experience moving pleasures, right? Since all of us have desires, and we all have the will to fulfill that desire. But when you're already in the process of fulfilling your desire, somehow, or at some point, like for other people, they will stop at the middle. Do you ever feel that way too? And you would even question yourself, and you would tell this to yourself: this is my desire, this is what I want, but am I satisfied? So this question leads me to conclusion that experiencing moving pleasures doesn't guarantee that you will experience or you will achieve static pleasure. There are certain circumstances where while we're at the process of achieving our desire, at the end, instead of feeling static pleasure or the state of satiety, then we would even feel pain or regret. Do you ever feel that way too? That question is for you to answer for yourselves. So for the next topic, this is still part of the types of pleasure, by the way. So a while ago we discussed about moving pleasures and static pleasures. So this time, Epicurus also distinguishes between physical and mental pleasures, and also pain. So physical pleasures and pains concern only the present, meaning the pleasure and pain that we can just grasp easily, or the pleasure and pain that we experience right now, whereas the mental pleasures encompass the past and the future. So in the past, it could be your remarkable memories, happy memories, or it could be pain and regrets, what we call bad memories. So for the future, it tackles about your confidence and fear of what will occur. And given that Epicurus puts emphasis on happiness and pleasure, he thinks that the greatest destroyer of happiness is the anxiety of the future. And I agree with him. Overthinking would only lead us to our own destruction. And if we are able to banish these thoughts, these negative thoughts, this overthinking, this fear about the future, then we can attain tranquility, or what we call atarasya, or the most exalted state, or in simple terms, peace of mind. And that's just pleasurable, right? What Epicurus is trying to say here is that we shouldn't hold back ourselves from achieving happiness by having negative thoughts, fears of the future, or for being an overthinker, because it will only lead us to our own destruction, and it will cause us great pain and anxiety. And anxiety is not to be taken lightly. As a person, we should be taking care of ourselves. We should look out for ourselves. But it's okay to have a companion that will help you get through hardships in life. But at the end of the day, the only person that can only help you is yourself. Moving on, we have here the types of desire. So because of the close connection of pleasure with desire satisfaction, Epicurus devotes a considerable part of his ethics to analyzing different kinds of desires. So if pleasure results from getting what you want and pain from not getting what you want, then there are two strategies that you can pursue with respect to any given desire. So one, you can strive to fulfill a desire, and two, you can try to eliminate the desire. So for Epicurus, he advocates the second strategy by paring your desires to a minimum core which can be easily satisfied. So let's get down to the three types of desires according to Epicurus. We have the natural and necessary desires, natural but necessary desires, and vain and empty desires. So examples of natural and necessary desires include the desires for food, shelter, clothing, and the like. So according to Epicurus, these desires are easy to be fulfilled but are difficult to be eliminated. This is because these desires are necessary for life, and also they are naturally limited, meaning this desire can be fulfilled even if it contributes in a small scale. For example, if we are hungry, then it only takes a limited amount of food to fill your stomach, and after which your desire is satisfied. So for Epicurus says that one should try to fulfill these desires. So these natural and necessary desires are not just part of our wants, but also part of our needs as a human being. So next is an example of a natural but not necessary desire. So that would be desire for luxury foods, or desire for expensive clothes. Although food and clothing are needed for survival, one does not need a particular type of food or clothes to survive. This natural but non-necessary desire is more like extravagance, or too much to ask. Thus, despite his hedonism, Epicurus advocates a surprisingly ascetic way of life. Although one shouldn't spurn extravagant foods or clothes if they happen to be available, becoming dependent on such goods ultimately leads to unhappiness. As Epicurus puts it, if you wish to make Pythocles wealthy, don't give him more money, rather reduce his desires. We can relate this to many things. For example, for a rich person's perspective, he is still unsatisfied by his wealth. And on the other hand, for a poor person, he doesn't feel like he is poor. Why is that? That is because they have different desires. So for a poor person to feel that he is poor, that means he doesn't have a desire for wealth, and that already makes him happy. He's happy for the way he is. He's happy for the way he have, and that's understandable. For the rich person who is unsatisfied for his wealth, then maybe he feel that way because he is unsatisfied for himself. I mean, he has high expectation for himself, and having high expectations for yourself but you cannot attain it will only cause you unhappiness. So for a rich person to feel happy for what he have, it is better, or I would advise to him that he should accept for what he has already, and also make a desire that he can attain, or a desire that can be attainable. So moreover, it states here that by eliminating the pain caused by unfulfilled desires and the anxiety that occurs because of the fear that one's desire will not be fulfilled in the future, the wise Epicurean attains tranquility and thus happiness. And so the last one that we're going to tackle for the types of desire would be vain and empty desires. So vain desires, they are common in our society. So vain desires include desire for power, wealth, fame, and the like. They are actually difficult to satisfy, in part because they have no natural limit. So if one desires wealth or power, no matter how much one gets, it is always possible to get more. And the more one gets, the more one wants. That is very true. So if you, for some people like this that has the desire for power and wealth and fame, when they get the taste of it, they always want more, and they wouldn't want to stop there. They're always unsatisfied, even if they are already having too much. So these desires, according to Epicurus, are not natural to human beings, but inculcated by society by false beliefs about what we need. Like, for example, believing that having power will bring us security from others. And actually, this kind of cases are apparent in our society, where one would only run for politics because they want to gain power, and they will do it for personal interest. And Epicurus thinks that these desires should be eliminated. So that ends my part of the report. Thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, so a while ago we have learned what is hedonism, psychological and ethical, types of pleasure, and types of desire. So at this juncture, let us talk about the virtues and justice of Epicurus. But for now, let's talk about the virtues first. So based from the passage that we have read, there are a lot of ideas I pointed out. So first, as you can see here in the first slide, we have Epicurus' hedonism was widely denounced in the ancient world as undermining traditional morality. So when we say hedonism, it simply means the doctrine that pleasure or happiness is the sole or chief good in life. So later on of this discussion, we will be able to know how come the hedonism of Epicurus was widely denounced in the ancient world. So for now, let's move forward to the next, which said that Epicurus insists that courage, moderation, and the other virtues are needed in order to attain happiness. And lastly, the virtue for Epicurus are all purely instrumental goods. So Epicurus' ethics was a form of egoistic hedonism. So meaning that the only thing essentially valuable is one's own pleasure. So anything else that has value is valuable merely as a means to securing pleasure for oneself. So Epicurus associated this theory to a refined and individual view of the nature of pleasure, which led him to recommend a virtuous, moderately frugal life as the best means to securing pleasure. And moreover, his ethical theories find a foundation in the Aristotelian commonplace that the highest good is what is valued for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. And Epicurus also agreed with Aristotle that happiness is the highest good. However, he disagreed with Aristotle by identifying happiness with pleasure. So Epicurus gave two reasons for this. So the main reason was that pleasure is the only thing that people do having value just for its own sake, and that is Epicurus' ethical hedonism is based upon his psychological hedonism. So everything we do, he claimed, we do for the sake of ultimately gaining pleasure for ourselves. So this is supposedly confirming by observing the obvious behavior of infants who instinctively pursue pleasure and shun pain. So the truth in this is also found in the behavior of adults like us. So but in adult, it is more difficult to see that this is the truth, since they have much more complicated beliefs, right? So beliefs about what will bring them pleasure. So that is why this hedonism was widely denounced in the ancient world as undermining traditional morality. So now let's go to the next slide. So it says that the third key point is that Epicurus says that all of the virtues are ultimately forms of prudence. So moreover, the greatest virtue and the basis for all virtue is prudence. So when we say prudence, it is the main, or it is the art of practical wisdom. It is something even more valuable than philosophy. So because all other virtues spring from it, so for the virtues are inseparable from a happy life, and living happily is inseparable from the virtue. So that's why it is considered that the ultimately form of virtue is prudence. So next is Epicurus goes against the majority of Greek ethical theorists such as the Stoics, who identify happiness with virtue, and Aristotle, who identifies happiness with a life of virtuous activity. So again, his ethical theories find a foundation in the Aristotle commonplace that says that the highest good is what is valued for its own sake, so and not for the sake of anything else. So Epicurus also agreed with Aristotle, and he disagreed by identifying happiness with pleasure. So next, let's go to the third slide, which says that Epicurus thinks that natural science and philosophy itself also are instrumental goods. So for him, natural science is indeed in order to give mechanistic explanations of natural phenomena and thus dispel the fear of the gods. And while philosophy, as he said, that helps to show us the natural limits of our desires and to dispel the fear of death. So it is very deep, right? So Moreover, for the explanation of the virtue, so Epicurus' idea of morality is distinct from but closely related to his better known doctrine that the goal of human life is pleasure. So I assume you better have ideas about pleasure. Yes, so explaining how Epicurus' unusual hedonism is connected to his complex theory of justice, so is an important step in demonstrating his moral theory. So Epicurus believed that human eudaimonia, well-being, lies at the foundation of justice, and that living well consists in living a life of hedon or pleasure. So in some sense, Epicurus believed that the desire for hedon is natural and basic for humans, and he thought that because of this, hedon is the basic good of human life. So that's what he said, right? So because he could not have meant by hedon what we usually mean by pleasure, his idea that well-being consists in a life of hedon is deeply misleading, and it has consequently borne the misunderstanding and the disapproval of the history of Western ethics. So that is why it is denounced on that era. So since the aim here is not to explicate Epicurus' hedonism nor to show wherein it is unique and misunderstood, it is simply asserted that his idea of the human good was unique and that it cannot properly be dismissed in the way most critics think it can. However, one understands Epicurus' hedonism and whether one rejects it, one can never nonetheless understand and appreciate his theory of morality and can begin to assist its interest and plausibility. So here's the main thing. Coupled with Epicurus' idea that hedon is the human good was his conviction that the virtues are naturally linked with and inseparable from is a life from hedon. So he regarded prudence, or what we actually know as practical intelligence or practical wisdom, as the foremost virtue, wherein natural source of all the remaining virtues. It teaches the impossibility of living pleasurably without living wisely, honorably, and justly, and the impossibility of living wisely, honorably, and justly without living pleasurably. So Epicurus' ideas about the importance and centrality of practical wisdom are very crucial. So we cannot deny that. So it is important first to understand that he believed that the living a life of hedon was not only compatible with the virtue of justice but actually required it. Such a belief will not seem feasible to those who would think that a life directed toward the acquisition of hedon would often exclude virtue. So a full understanding of Epicurus' notion of hedon and eudaimonia would help dispel this impression. And then moreover, in any case, the main point of mentioning the connection between hedon and virtue is to indicate how Epicurus combined his advocacy of the life of hedon with his advocacy of the justice life. So we are done discussing or talking about the virtues of Epicurus. So now let's move forward to the justice. So as you can see here in this slide, it is pointed out that justice is an agreement neither to harm nor be harmed, and that we have a preconception of justice as what is useful in mutual association. So as you know, Epicurus is one philosopher who believed in living a life full of pleasure. So according to him, life without harm, therefore a life without pain, was the definition of living a just life. So it is just a life. So without harm, there was no possibility of pain, and therefore pleasure is achieved, which constituted justice. So injustice is brought about by pain, which in his perspective does not bring pleasure. So consequently, a life that focuses on pleasure is a just one, since it constitutes doing what is right to avoid pain. So now let's move forward. People enter into communities in order to gain protection from the dangers of the wild, and agreements concerning the behavior of the members of the community are needed in order for these communities to function. So, like for example, prohibitions of murder, regulations concerning the killing and eating of animals, and so on. So, justice exists only where there are such agreements. So, now let's go to the next slide. So, as you can see there, it is pointed out that justice is valued entirely on instrumental grounds rather. So because of its utility for each of the members of society. So now, Epicurus believes that the pain is the beginning of injustice to oneself of society. So a life filled with pain does not constitute a just life, since there is no pleasure when pain is present. So common sense, right? So in his perception, every human being should be in pursuit of pleasure because no one would love to live in pain, right? So I know that all of us would agree that no one would love to live in pain. So while in pursuit of pleasure, justice is achieved since the person would not bring or cause harm either to himself or to the society. So pain which is brought about by harm is the main source of injustice. So pursuing pleasure involves refraining from doing what does not bring pleasure to oneself, but ensuring that obtaining utmost personal pleasure would be the true definition of justice. So Epicurus added that the main reason not to be unjust is that one will be punished if one gets caught, and that even if one does not get caught, the fear of being caught will still cause pain. So, however, he adds that the fear of punishment is needed mainly to keep fools in line. So, who otherwise would kill, steal, and a lot more. So, although justice only exists where there is an agreement about how to behave, that does not make justice entirely conventional. So, if by conventional we mean that any behavior dictated by the laws of a particular society is thereby just, and that the laws of a particular society are just for that society. So, next, it is pointed out the justice contract. So, justice contract is entered into for the purpose of securing what is useful for the members of the society. Only laws that are actually useful are just. So, therefore, a murder prohibition would be just, but laws on anti-miscegenation would not. So, since what is useful can vary from place to place and from time to time, exactly what laws are can also vary. So, in addition to the explanation of justice, so this would involve forming a circle of friends who believe in the same beliefs as you, since associating with individuals who had different definitions of true happiness and pleasure would not bring true pleasure, as this would mean that you would have to live a life of pleasing others other than yourself, therefore not finding pleasure, which ultimately results to injustice to self. So all efforts exerted by human beings are intended for the pursuit of personal pleasure. So desire for many things was not necessary, as this would not cause pleasure, since one cannot attain all that he believes he wants to acquire in life. So instead, one should be content with what they have, and this can be best portrayed by his perception about life and death. So he did not think it is pleasurable to pursue the pain that is brought about by thoughts of death, since when living, death is not present, and once you are dead, then life is not there, right? So therefore, there is no meaningful gain in bringing harm to oneself by contemplating the pain that is brought about by death, since none exists in the presence of the other, and such thoughts only brings pain, thus creating a source of personal injustice. So we should not cause harm to ourselves. So, according to his understanding, limiting the desires that an individual may have and expelling all forms of fear, especially the fear of the gods and death, would result to a life full of pleasure and justice. So, moreover, Epicurus also noticed that there are other forms of pleasure that have negative results, and the acquisition of such pleasure brings more pain than pleasure once sought, thus resulting to injustice of self. So according to him, pleasure is achieved through happiness, which is brought about by relating with friends who possess similar virtues to yours, and also possessing a peace of mind. So it is really important, right, if your friends are your circle of friends are having the same beliefs or having the same mindset in order to gain peace, in order to gain happiness or pleasure. So honest living, which brings about a peaceful mind and pleasure to oneself, as well as bringing justice to self and to others. So Epicurus truly advocated for pleasure, which would bring about justice, which, avoiding all forms of fear and pain, would bring about the pleasure, thus resulting to justice to self and to society in general. So pursuit of pleasure, which was free from any forms of negative consequences, was his definition of justice. So I think you already got the main point. What does Epicurus trying to tell us or trying to convey, right? So in conclusion, we often are reminded that in making moral evaluations, we must take into account not only the things that people do, but also the intentions, motives, and desires governing their actions, right? So indeed, many contemporary ethical theorists have argued that until we develop an adequately grounded moral psychology capable of explaining the psychological and motivational background of our actions, we cannot begin to approach moral questions with any reasonable assurance or prospects of success. So in conclusion, we often are reminded that in making moral evaluations, we must take into account not only the things that people do, but also the intentions, motives, and desires governing their actions. So indeed, many contemporary ethical theorists have argued that until we develop an adequately grounded moral psychology capable of explaining the psychological and motivational background of our actions, we cannot begin to approach moral questions with any reasonable assurance of prospects of success. So this concern with moral psychology has led on the whole to a renewed appreciation of the methods and conclusions of Greek ethical thought. So that's where our discussion ends. So I hope that you understand the things that I said a while ago about the from the beginning, which is from the virtues, the discussion of the virtues, until the discussion of the justice. So I hope the things that I have mentioned earlier, you will reflect on it, on why we should take care of ourselves, why we should not cause harm or pain to ourselves, or why should we take care of ourselves on giving pleasures, and what could it do to us. So I know that there will be a lot of things that we could reflect on from the passage or from the views of Epicurus, the virtues and justice. So that's all, and thank you for listening.
Good day, everyone. I am Jhon Rio Suarez, and I am the last reporter of the group. So today, I will discuss to you the topic about friendship and death. So the first one is about friendship. So the topic about friendship was very important among the philosophers down to the end of 19th century, but only few of them value friendship so highly as compared to Epicurus. Now the question is, what is the value of friendship? So as I've read Epicurus' view on friendship, I can say that Epicurus' view on friendship is perplexing, meaning it's very confusing because he seems to suggest that friendship have an intrinsic worth, yet this appears to run counter to the ethical hedonism that frames his entire philosophy. In other words, it is very unclear if he takes friendship to have an intrinsic worth or merely an instrumental worth. Now, let us base on the principal doctrines number 27 and 28. So number 27 states that of all the means which are procured by wisdom to ensure happiness throughout the whole of life, by far the most important is the acquisition of friends. Number 28 states that the same conviction which inspires confidence that nothing we have to fear is eternal or even of long duration also enables us to see that even in our limited actions of life, nothing enhances our security so much as friendship. So if we look at this, I think this has some strange properties if we think of it as the definition of friendship. So as what Epicurus stated, that the most important thing to ensure happiness is the acquisition of friends, and nothing enhances our security so much as friendship. So what does this tell us? So Epicurus wants us to realize that friends are means to make our life safer and easier. Like we call on them in times of need, they respond to our call, they come and they help us, and they make our lives safe and happy. Now, I want to compare this with Aristotle's view on friendship, which he states that for this cause, it would seem that we ought to summon our friends readily to share our good fortunes, for the beneficent character is a noble one, but summon them to our bad fortunes with hesitation. So, Aristotle clearly says that we should call on our friends during the good times in order for us to share our happiness. On the other hand, we should only, with hesitation, call on our friends during the bad times, which means that we should not call on our friends during the bad times because we don't want to become a burden to them with our misfortunes. So as we can see, Aristotle has a much more sensible idea of friendship as compared to Epicurus. Now, friendship is perhaps the very cornerstone of an Epicurean community. In his Vatican sayings, Epicurus stated that every friendship is worth choosing for its own sake, though it takes its origin from the benefits it confers upon us. Nonetheless, in defining pleasure as the ultimate good, Epicurus is committed to a focus on friendship's utility for pleasure for individuals, not on its intrinsic value. So as we can see, Epicurus is only concerned with the usefulness of friendship for the person, and not so much with pleasing the friends or with the value of friendship as a human relationship in itself. Now, we can see that Epicurean hedonism, which aims at self-gratification, aims at making yourself happy, and it is primarily egoistic. So, the whole Epicurean philosophy is primarily egoistic, and it aims at, or its point is to make yourself happy. Therefore, Epicurus and Aristotle have very different views on friendship within their philosophies. Although they both believe that friendship plays an important role in our lives, however, the reasoning behind in which we choose and create friendships and the purpose of friendship that provides to an individual or the society creates the division between them. So in here we can see that the major differences between Aristotle and Epicurus can be found in their definition of living well, because Aristotle has the idea that virtue and the good is or should be our ultimate goal. So unlike Epicurus' view that pleasure is the goal which supersedes all others. Therefore, the significance of friendship all throughout Epicurus' work is intertwined with safety, security, freedom of disturbance, what do you call that, self-sufficiency, feelings and emotion, and when it is combined in balance with pleasure and pain, it creates a prosperous life. And in such a life, one can be free to flourish and live well. So in here, we can conclude that Epicurus believed that friendship is one of the highest necessities in fulfilling a pleasurable life. Now, let's move further and let's talk about the topic about death. So we all know that death is inevitable. So in order for us to live a life without the fear of the most frightening of bad things, then we must accept or live the Epicurean view of death, that death is not a harm. Now, there are two components to Epicurus' conclusion that death is nothing to us. The first one is that all good and bad consists of sense experience. So in here, Epicurus is defining harm as all things that cause negative experiences. On the other hand, the second component is that death is a privation of sense experience. So this is a clarification of what he means or what he says death. Like for example, the process of being burned to death is not harmful. So when Epicurus mentions death, he is referring to the state of non-existence where there is no awareness. Therefore, these two components helps in justifying his claim, and that is if all we can say that if all he meant that if all harm is grounded in awareness and death is the absence of awareness, then death is not a harm. Now, I will elaborate further in order for you to fully understand the topic. So, Epicurus wants us to realize that if we are dead, then we do not exist anymore, so death is not affecting us. On the other hand, if we are not yet dead, so death is also not affecting us. So either way, death is not affecting us, so death is nothing to be worried about. So Epicurus used this argument, and he urged his followers to use this argument in order to consider the nature of death, and and to also understand that death is nothing to be worried about because death is not affecting us, in order to remove anxiety. So Epicurus, like any other philosophers, were very interested in removing anxiety from our lives, like vanishing anxiety, dispelling it from our souls. So this is how he does it, because he observed that we are afraid of death and we are afraid of what might come after death. A recipe for quelling death anxiety. So now let us take a look on Epicurus' 3 well-known arguments which are still used today in order to treat anxiety. The first one is the mortality of the soul. So this just means that as we no longer possess any consciousness once we die, this means that we can also no longer attain or feel any punishments after death, or nor have any regrets for the life that has been lost. So the second one is death as annihilation. So according to Epicurus, that if all aspects of the body disintegrate at death, that is both body and soul, then death would be nothing to us as we cannot perceive it. So this is also called the no subject of harm agreement. This agreement puts forth the idea that if death is bad, then who can be bad for? Well, we're certainly not the living, because they are not dead, and neither for the dead, since they do not exist anymore and they cannot perceive anything. Hence, for something to be bad, we need to experience it being unpleasant in the first place. So when we die, we won't know that we are dead. And if we need to be alive just for us to feel, then death is not to cause us any pain. So in this case, there is no reason for us to be afraid of death now or at the present. So the third and the last one is the symmetry argument. So in here, Epicurus urges us that we should contemplate and contrast a state of non-being after death with the time before our birth. He says that these two states are identical because, as if nature has given us an insight on how our future period of non-existence would look like. That is why Epicurus wants us to be not afraid of death now, because it would be the same just before we were born. Like, we will feel nothing and we will know nothing. In other words, before we were born, we are nothing, and that's the nothing that we will become again. Once again, I am Mega Ginger and Suarez. Thank you and God bless.